They laughed, calling her a crippled rat, as they squeezed ketchup all over the art she spent weeks on. Little did they know the men who just walked into the diner witnessed everything, and they are about to make them pay. Welcome to Blissful Whispers. We are so glad to have you here. Before we see what happens next, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story where justice is served. The air at the Maplewood Diner always smelled of two things: the sweet, heavy warmth of butter and syrup, and the sharp, woody scent of graphite. For Eliza, tucked into the back corner booth, the graphite always won. This was her place. Her arrival was a practiced, silent ritual, an act of muscle memory that bypassed thought. A soft squeak from the left wheel of her chair on the linoleum, a precise 90-degree turn that brought her parallel to the table. She then gripped the formica edge, her knuckles white for a moment, and pivot, sliding from the chair to the vinyl booth seat. The motion was fluid, economical, and entirely her own. Her wheelchair sat folded beside her, a familiar, loyal shadow. Brenda, the waitress whose perpetually tired eyes Eliza had captured in charcoal a dozen times, didn't even ask. A mug of black coffee appeared, its steam curling into the morning light. "Got a fresh pot going, hun?" Brenda would murmur, and that was that. This booth was her island. The vinyl, cracked like an old map, was her territory. Here she wasn't just Eliza. She was the artist. She pulled the sketchbook from her bag. It wasn't a flimsy school notebook. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume, its cover worn soft as old money, the corners permanently rounded. She opened it to a fresh page, the crisp shush of the paper a private counterpoint to the diner's public clatter, the sizzle of bacon on the flat top, the clinking of heavy ceramic, the low murmur of morning gossip. This was her studio. This right here was her voice. Her pencil found old Mr. Henderson at the counter, his tweed cap pulled low. Eliza's gaze was intense, analytical. She wasn't just drawing his face, she was capturing the intricate, delicate road map of laugh lines that fanned from the corners of his eyes, a testament to a life lived with at least some joy. She recorded the way his left index finger was permanently stained with newsprint, and the tiny, proud tilt of his chin as he argued with the sports page. To the other patrons, if they bothered to look at all, Eliza was a fixture. The girl in the wheelchair. A subject of quiet pity, a brief, uncomfortable thought to be navigated around, or, most often, simply a part of the background as inanimate as the jukebox. They saw the chair first, her second, and her art not at all. Brenda returned, setting a glass of water on the table. "You need anything else, Eliza?" Eliza looked up, her focus breaking. "No, thank you, Brenda. This is perfect." She smiled and reached for the glass. And that's when they would have seen it if they'd been looking. The tremor. Her left hand, as it rested on her lap, held a faint, persistent vibration. But when she reached for the water, that vibration became a tiny, visible earthquake. The glass rattled softly against her fingers as she gripped it. She pressed her lips firm, a familiar hot flash of frustration in her eyes, as she carefully guided the water to her mouth and took a sip. Her hand betrayed her. It was a traitor, revealing a frailty she despised. But then she set the glass down. She picked up the pencil. The transformation was absolute. The tremor vanished. The shaking in her fingers, the chaotic energy that fumbled with a simple glass, ceased. It was as if the graphite itself was a lightning rod, drawing all that scattered, nervous static into a single, perfect, conductive point. Her hand, the one that had just betrayed her, became steady as stone. The lines she laid down on the page were not shaky or weak or uncertain. They were clean, confident, and sharp. She captured the precise curve of Brenda's apron, tied in a small, defiant bow, a tiny flare of personality in a uniform world. She was a silent observer, yes. The world outside the Maplewood's plate glass windows could demand and judge and pity. But in here, with the smell of coffee grounds and pencil shavings filling her lungs, she was the one with the power. The power to see. The power to define. In these pages she was not the subject. She was the narrator. The diner's bell was meant to jingle. It was a cheerful, welcoming sound that usually accompanied a blast of cold air and a new customer. This time it didn't jingle. It clanged. It was a harsh, jarring sound, a piece of metal slammed against metal, a percussive wielding violation of the morning's peace. The sound was followed by the voices. Not the low murmur of conversation, but a full-volume, braying laugh that sliced through the quiet. 3 young men swaggered in, led by Marcus. He wasn't just walking. He was parading, his shoulders thrown back, his chin jutting, a look of profound, unearned entitlement radiating from him. He wore his arrogance like a new jacket, and he wanted everyone to see it. His 2 friends were cheap copies, orbiting him, their laughter a half-beat behind his, their eyes constantly flicking to him for approval. They didn't just enter the diner, they invaded it. Their eyes immediately swept the room, not looking for a seat, but for an audience. They needed to be seen, to be acknowledged. They were a performance, and the entire diner had just been made their unwilling stage. Eliza felt the shift in atmosphere before she even looked up. The ambient noise of the diner, the scraping of forks, the turning of pages, sputtered and died. Mr. Henderson's newspaper rustled as he lowered it. Brenda's hand, holding the coffee pot, froze mid-air. The trio's gaze swept past the old man, past the nervous waitress, and landed on the back booth. On Eliza. Marcus's smirk widened. This was perfect. A built-in prop. He pointed with his chin, and the 3 of them made their way over. They didn't just sit. They collapsed into the booth directly behind Eliza's. The vinyl groaned under their weight, and the impact sent a solid, jarring vibration through the shared partition. The table leg bumped her folded wheelchair. Her coffee cup shivered, the dark liquid lapping at the rim. The invasion was now personal. They were at her back, a physical, looming presence. The whisper started. A low, snickering rumble. She couldn't make out the words, just the texture of the sound, the conspiratorial, cruel cadence of mockery. It was the sound of the schoolyard, the sound she had spent her entire life trying to outrun. She could feel their eyes on the back of her head, a hot, prickling sensation. She tried to will her hand to move, to continue the line she was drawing, but it was frozen. She stared at the half-finished drawing of Mr. Henderson, her pencil hovering, her sanctuary suddenly, irrevocably breached. "Check it out," one of the friends whispered, loud enough to carry. "She's, like, drawing." "Should dude," Marcus said, his voice a stage whisper. You'll spook it." A new burst of sniggering. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut for a single painful second. "Don't look. Don't engage. Be invisible." She took a shaky breath and reached for her water glass, desperate for a simple, normalizing action. But her body, always the traitor, chose that precise moment to betray her. The tremor, usually a faint vibration, amplified under the stress. Her hand shook, the glass rattling against the table as she fumbled to grip it. A sudden sharp ooh-hoo from the booth behind her. And then Marcus's voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was loud, clear, and performative, aimed not just at her, but at the entire, silent diner. "Careful," he sneered, his voice dripping with a thick, syrupy condescension. "Wouldn't want to shake things up." The joke landed. His friends erupted in loud, howling, hyena-like laughter. The sound was obscene in the quiet room. Eliza's face burned, a hot spike of humiliation so sharp it stole her breath. She snatched her hand back from the glass. The pencil in her other hand felt slick with sweat. The entire diner was watching her, their pity almost as painful as the mockery. This was the moment. The moment she was supposed to cry or hide her face or leave. And then, she didn't. Something cold and hard settled in her stomach. It was defiance. She took one slow, deliberate breath. She exhaled. Her shoulders, which had tensed into hard knots, lowered. Her knuckles, already white, gripped the pencil so tightly it was a wonder it didn't snap. She did not turn around. She did not look at them. She did not even blink. Eliza deliberately, defiantly, lowered her gaze back to the sketchbook. She found the line she had abandoned. And with a hand that was now, miraculously, as steady as granite, she pressed the graphite to the paper and drew. It was a perfect, clean, unwavering line. She was erasing them. She was refusing to be small. She was, in the only way she knew how, fighting back. Marcus's voice was filled with that awful, sneering entitlement that makes your skin crawl. It's the voice of someone who has never been told no, who believes the world is their playground and everyone else is just set dressing. If you also can't stand people who think they are better than everyone else, take a second to like this video. Only people who agree with Bullies would just scroll past and do nothing. Her action was quieter than a whisper, but it landed like a slap in the face. The laughter from the booth behind her stopped. Not tapered off but stopped. Abruptly. Cut off. The silence that followed was 100 times more threatening than the noise had been. Marcus had delivered his punchline, and his victim hadn't flinched. She hadn't cried. She had, in no uncertain terms, ignored him. She had denied him his power. A dark, cold fury began to radiate from the booth behind her. The air, already tense, became thick and dangerous. Marcus was no longer performing for the room. This was personal. He leaned forward, his voice a low, menacing growl, all traces of humor gone. "Hey, I'm talking to you." The cold, menacing shift in Marcus's voice made Eliza's blood run cold. "Hey, I'm talking to you." He leaned over the partition between the booths. His shadow fell across her sketchbook, a sudden, oppressive darkness. He was too close, invading her space, his presence a physical weight. Eliza flinched, her body instinctively curling inward, a primal urge to protect. "What's that?" he sneered, his eyes dropping to her page. "Drawing your little pictures?" His tone was dismissive, as if her art was a child's scribble, something beneath his contempt. But his eyes, they weren't dismissive. They were locked on the page with a strange, predatory focus. He saw her defiance, her private world, and in that instant he decided to shatter it. Eliza's hand instinctively moved, a sparrow-like flutter, to cover the page to shield her voice. But she was too late. In one horrifyingly casual motion, Marcus reached for the red plastic ketchup bottle on his table. It wasn't a clumsy grab. It wasn't a fumbled accident. It was a smooth, fluid, deliberate act. His fingers wrapped around the bottle. His thumb found the cap. He flipped it open with an audible click. Time seemed to slow, to stretch into a thick, agonizing taffy. Eliza's "no" was a strangled whisper caught in her throat. And then, with a malicious, triumphant squeeze, he sent a thick, red arc flying over the partition. It wasn't just a drip. It was a deluge. A wet, vulgar splat echoed in the diner as the ketchup struck the open sketchbook. The red line was obscene. It landed directly in the center of the page, obliterating the intricate, delicate portrait of Mr. Henderson. The laugh lines she had rendered with such care were now drowned in a sticky, crimson flood. The graphite, her steady, confident voice, was smeared, murdered, and buried. The diner gasped. It was a single, sharp, collective intake of breath, a sound of unified horror. Someone dropped a fork, and the metallic clatter on the tile floor was like a gunshot in the sudden, terrible silence. "Oops," Marcus barked, his voice breaking the spell. He threw his head back and laughed, a loud, ugly sound of pure triumph. "Looks like it needed some color." His friends, released from the tension, erupted. They howled, cheering, slamming their hands on their own table. "Got him," one yelled as if it were a game. "Dude, that's awesome." But the rest of the diner was frozen. Mr. Henderson, the subject of the ruined portrait, stared from the counter. His newspaper was lowered, his face a mask of rigid, impotent disapproval. His mouth was a thin, white, silent line. Brenda, the waitress, stood trapped in the aisle, the coffee pot still hovering in her hand. Her face was pale, a storm of rage and terror. Her eyes, wide with shock, met Eliza's. And in them, Eliza saw the most crushing blow of all, a helpless, terrified apology. Brenda was a prisoner just like her. She did nothing. Eliza stared at the page. The ringing in her ears was louder than the bullies' cheers. She wasn't crying. The shock was too deep, too cold. She was numb. She watched the viscid red mess continue to bleed. It was a living, malevolent thing, sinking into the fibers of the paper, staining everything it touched. It wasn't just on the page, it was in it. The sweet, vinegary stench of it filled her nostrils, a sickening perfume that she knew, with a dreadful certainty, she would never be able to forget. It was the smell of her own humiliation. This wasn't just a ruined drawing. This was a message. This was her smeared. Her passion dismissed. Her voice choked and silenced. The graphite lines, which had been her defiant, steady strength, were now just a pathetic, gray suggestion beneath a blanket of red. Her pencil, the tool that had been her sword and shield, had rolled uselessly from her slackened fingers. It lay on the floor, forgotten. The diner had fractured into three distinct, isolated worlds. There was the island of the bullies, a bubble of hot, obnoxious noise and victory. There was the frozen, silent continent of the other patrons, a museum of fear, their inaction a deafening roar. And then there was Eliza. She was in the cold, silent vacuum between them. She had never, in her entire life, felt so completely, so devastatingly alone. The laughter from Marcus was a wound. But the silence from everyone else, that was the salt. As Eliza stared at the ruin, the rest of the diner just looked away. They did nothing. Their silence was a betrayal, a confirmation that her world, her art, her dignity wasn't worth the trouble. That she wasn't worth defending. If you believe that silence makes you part of the problem, that it's just another way of siding with the bully, comment, courage, below. Show the world you would have spoken up. Let's see who is willing to stand against entitled, toxic cowards like Marcus. Eliza's hand, the one that had held the pencil, began to shake again. It hovered over the sticky, ruined page, a gesture of profound helplessness. The tremor was back, no longer a faint vibration, but a violent, racking quake born not of her condition, but of pure, white-hot, powerless rage. She couldn't fix it. It was done. The ruin was absolute. The hot, braying laughter of Marcus and his friends eventually subsided, not out of shame but out of satisfaction. The joke was over. The point had been made. For them, the interaction was finished, a completed act of casual dominance. Marcus, wiping a smirk from his face, snapped his fingers. It was a sharp, imperious sound like a striking match. Brenda, who was still frozen in the aisle, flinched. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice dripping with the easy confidence of someone who has never been denied. "Waitress, we're hungry. 3 cheeseburger deluxes, extra bacon, and a round of Cokes. And, make 'em fast." The arrogance was absolute. It was a staggering, breathtaking display of impunity. To destroy something, to inflict a wound so personal and deep, and then to order lunch. It was a statement clearer than any words. You don't matter. What I did to you doesn't matter. You are so far beneath me that your pain is not even an interruption to my day. Eliza heard it. Every word. She was still staring at the ruined page, the sickeningly sweet smell of the ketchup and miasma in the air. The sound of Marcus ordering food was a second violation, a shovel of dirt on the grave of her dignity. The rest of the diner seemed to exhale, a quiet, defeated sigh. The show was over. The bullies had won. Mr. Henderson slowly, stiffly turned back to his newspaper, his moral failure hanging heavy in the air. Life, broken and ugly, was resuming. But the scene was not as complete as it appeared. The diner was not just a collection of victims and perpetrators. There was another element. At the far end of the counter, seated on the last stool, a man had been sitting. He had been there for an hour, long before Eliza had even arrived, long before the sun had fully cleared the building across the street. He was visible to the room only as a back. A wall. He was a mountain of worn, black leather, his shoulders so broad they seemed to test the seams of the vest he wore. The leather was not new or fashionable. It was scarred, cracked, and faded in ways that spoke of thousands of miles of sun and wind. It was a second skin, a suit of armor. This was Jack's. He had not moved. He hadn't turned. He hadn't flinched at the bell or the laughter, or the sound of the ketchup hitting the paper. He had simply sat, his entire presence a block of dense, dormant, gravitational stillness. In front of him sat a single heavy ceramic mug. The coffee in it had gone cold an hour ago. He was nursing it, but he wasn't drinking. He was waiting. He had seen it all. The long, polished mirror that ran the length of the back bar was his vantage point. It was his private cinema. He had watched the reflection of the 3 young men as they swaggered in, their entitlement a toxic cloud. He had watched them target the girl in the booth. He had seen her hand tremble on the water glass. He had heard the sneer, "Wouldn't want to shake things up." He had seen Eliza's defiance, that small, powerful act of returning her pencil to the paper. He'd seen the flicker of rage in Marcus's reflection. And yes, he had watched, with an almost analytical stillness, as the red bottle was raised, as the arc of ketchup flew, as the girl's spirit visibly shattered. Now, as Marcus called out his order, Jax's head moved. It was the first time in 60 minutes. It was a slow, minimal, almost imperceptible tilt. His gaze lifted, not to the bullies, not to Eliza, but to the reflection in the mirror. The mirror captured the entire, ugly diorama. It framed the scene like a painting. In the background, Eliza, small, broken, and alone in her booth of wreckage. In the midground, the bullies, loud, victorious, and already forgetting. In the foreground, the terrified, paralyzed patrons, their faces a gallery of quiet shame. And in the center of it all, reflecting back at him, were Jax's own eyes. They were not angry. Anger is a hot, messy, reactive emotion. Anger is what Marcus felt. No, Jax's eyes were cold. They were the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. They were the color of polished steel. There was no fury in them. There was no shock. There was only a profound, unsettling clarity. He was not looking at the scene with outrage. He was looking at it with assessment. He was a craftsman examining a piece of broken work, calculating the force required to set it right. He was a judge, absorbing the final piece of evidence before passing a sentence. His gaze held on the reflection of Marcus, who was now laughing again, telling some joke to his friends. Jax watched him, his expression utterly flat, unreadable. He took in the expensive watch on Marcus's wrist, the casual cruelty in his smile, the absolute lack of consequence. He had seen enough. Jax's steel-cold gaze remained fixed on the mirror, a silent, calculating observer. He had finished his assessment. His eyes, which had been locked on the reflection of Marcus, now shifted, moving 2 feet to the left. They found Brenda. She was still standing in the aisle, a statue of terrified indecision. The coffee pot in her hand was no longer steaming. Its contents were lukewarm, forgotten. Her knuckles were white on the handle. She was trapped, her fear a visible cage. In the glass their eyes met. Brenda's gaze was a silent scream, a plea for help, an apology for her own inaction, a desperate, drowning look. Jax's response was almost nothing. It was not a nod, not in the traditional sense. It was a single downward twitch of his eyebrow, a fractional tightening of the muscle at his jaw. It was a gesture so minimal, so economical, that anyone else would have missed it. But Brenda saw it. A jolt went through her as if he'd touched her with a live wire. Her eyes widened, the terror momentarily replaced by a different, sharper emotion. It wasn't hope. Hope is a soft, optimistic thing. This was knowledge. It was the sudden, heart-stopping realization that a different, more ancient set of rules was about to be invoked. She understood. Brenda immediately broke eye contact, her face paling. She turned, not towards the bullies' table to take their order, but in a stiff, robotic motion towards the kitchen, as if fleeing the dining room before the storm broke. With Brenda's terrified acknowledgement, Jax's part in the silent contract was complete. He was no longer just a watcher. He was a participant. His hand, which had been resting on the counter like a slab of granite, moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, a tectonic shift. It was not the quick, reactive movement of anger. It was the unhurried, purposeful movement of intent. His hand slid from the counter and disappeared into the depths of his leather vest, finding a deep, hidden pocket. When it re-emerged, it was not holding a wallet. It was holding a phone. It wasn't a sleek, modern smartphone. It was a relic. An old, scarred, black flip phone, its plastic casing worn smooth at the edges, its weight heavy and substantial. It was a tool, not a toy. A brick. A detonator. Jax did not look down at it. His eyes remained fixed on the mirror, watching the room, watching the reflected, oblivious form of Marcus, who was now telling a story, his hands gesturing expansively. By touch alone, his thumb, thick and calloused, found the seam. He flipped it open. The click of the hinge was a dull, flat, final sound in the quiet diner, like a latch on a heavy gate. His thumb moved again, pressing a single, worn-down button. A speed dial. He didn't need to type. The screen lit up with a faint, blue glow, illuminating his scarred knuckles, but his eyes never left the mirror. One word. Maplewood. He hit send. He clicked the phone shut. The sound was another note of finality. A punctuation mark. The message was sent. The call was made. Jax slipped the phone back into the silent, waiting pocket of his vest. His hand returned to the counter, resting beside the mug. Everything was as it had been. Then he picked up the cold coffee. His movements were unhurried. He raised the heavy mug to his lips and took a long, slow sip. He was a man who had just set a very heavy, very dangerous machine in motion and was now content to simply wait for it to arrive. The air in the diner had changed. The intervention that was coming was not a coincidence. It was not a random act of fate. It was a summons. The judge, sitting quietly at the counter, had just called the executioners. Jax just sent the signal. He's not going to let this stand. He's not going to let this entitled, arrogant coward just walk away. If you believe that cruelty and entitlement must have consequences, that people like Marcus have to be held accountable, then hit that subscribe button right now. Only people who think Marcus should get away with it, who are fine with this kind of toxic behavior, would refuse to join us. The diner became a tomb. The air, which had been electric with shock, now settled into a thick, suffocating blanket of shared shame. The only movement was the slow, inexorable ticking of the round-faced clock above the kitchen pass-through. Each tick was a hammer blow, driving home the awful, unchangeable reality of what had happened. 10 minutes. That's how long it was. 10 minutes that stretched into an eternity. Brenda eventually re-emerged from the kitchen, her face pale and waxy. She carried a tray, and her hands were shaking so violently that the plates on it rattled, a tiny, terrible percussion against the silence. She had to serve them. She had to walk over to the booth, to the epicenter of the violation, and place their food in front of them. Marcus didn't even look up at her. He just grabbed the first arriving plate. "About time," he muttered around a laugh at something his friend had said. The sound of their voices, normal and casual, was a fresh desecration. But worse was the sound of their eating. The sharp, metallic scrape of Marcus's fork against the ceramic plate as he shoveled in a bite of cheeseburger. The wet, satisfied crunch of a French fry. And then the smell. The hot, greasy, salty aroma of their food drifted over the partition and collided with the smell at Eliza's table. The sickly, sweet, vinegary stench of the ketchup was still thick in the air. The two smells, the normal, comforting smell of a diner lunch and the new, horrific smell of her humiliation, mingled, creating a nauseating perfume. It was the smell of cruelty winning. The smell of life moving on, completely indifferent to the wreckage. Eliza's tears had dried. They had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow feeling that was worse than the initial, fiery pain. The hot flash of rage and humiliation had burned out, and now she was just cold, empty. This was the real nightmare. Not the attack itself. That was fast and hot. The nightmare was the after. The cold, silent, indifferent world that just kept turning, that allowed the attackers to simply order lunch. Her hand, no longer shaking, moved with a slow, robotic precision. She reached for the cover of her sketchbook. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the worn leather. Then, carefully as if handling a dead thing, she closed it. The sound was a soft, wet thwomp. The ruined pages, still sticky and saturated, met the clean page opposite. They stuck together, a permanent, messy wound. It wasn't the clean shush of paper it was supposed to be. It was the sound of a seal. The sound of finality. It felt, Eliza thought, like closing a coffin. She had just buried her voice. She slid the heavy book back into her bag, the movement stiff and awkward. She wanted it gone. She wanted to pretend it had never existed. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, tight, protective gesture, and stared at the wood grain of the table. In the booth behind her, the laughter was starting up again. Marcus was telling a story, his voice loud, his arrogance fully restored, if it had ever wavered at all. His friends, their mouths full, were grunting in appreciation. They had already forgotten her. The incident was over. They had won. At the counter, Mr. Henderson was methodically folding his newspaper, his movements crisp, preparing to leave. He placed a few dollars on the counter, his gaze firmly averted from the back of the diner. Even Brenda was now busy, wiping down a different, safer section of the counter, her back to everyone. The isolation was complete. And then, a sound. It was so quiet at first, Eliza thought she was imagining it, that it was just the ringing in her own ears. A low, bass-heavy rumble. Faint, distant, like a truck idling on the highway a mile away. But the highway was the other direction. She didn't move. She just listened, her body tensing. The rumble didn't fade. A truck on the highway would fade, its sound diminishing as it passed. This sound was growing. It was building. It was not the singular, mechanical churn of a single engine. This was layered. A chord. A deep, guttural vibration that seemed to be coming not from the air, but from the ground itself. Mr. Henderson, his hand on his wallet, paused. He tilted his head. The rumble became a vibration. It was no longer just a sound, it was a physical sensation. The tabletop beneath Eliza's forearms began to hum. She looked down and saw the black, cold coffee in her mug. The surface was no longer still. It was shivering, tiny concentric rings dancing on the dark liquid. The windows rattled. A high, buzzing shiver ran through the plate glass, a sound of teeth chattering. The laughter in Marcus's booth died mid-joke. The scraping of Brenda's rag on the counter stopped. The entire diner, which had just begun to thaw, froze solid once more. The rumble was no longer distant. It was in the parking lot. It was here. It was a deep, angry, multi-tongued roar, like an approaching storm, like a caged beast that had just been let loose. And it was getting louder and louder and louder until it was the only thing in the world. The low, subaudible hum from the diner floor was no longer a query. It was a statement. The vibration, which had been a faint, nervous dance in Eliza's coffee cup, escalated. The surface of the dark liquid now shivered, tiny seismic rings collapsing on themselves as the tabletop itself began to resonate with the growing external force. Then the windows began to groan. It was not a rattle but a deep, stressed moan from the glass panes, as if the very air pressure outside was changing. A high, whining vibration like a dentist's drill joined the chorus, a sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. Mr. Henderson, his hand frozen on the money by his plate, looked up, his face a mask of confusion. Brenda, rag in hand, was paralyzed, her eyes wide and fixed on the front door. The sound, which had been a ground-based rumble, now had a new, sharp, mechanical texture. A staccato, overlapping crack-crack-crack of multiple, unmuffled engines. Patrons craned their necks, their eyes drawn to the large plate-glass windows. The parking lot, just moments before a half-empty stretch of morning asphalt, was now a roiling sea of steel and black leather. One by one, headlights pierced the morning sun as two dozen heavy motorcycles wheeled into the lot. They were not parking. They were taking positions. With a tactical, practiced precision that was far more terrifying than a chaotic mob, they fanned out, forming a perfect, menacing semicircle. It was a crescent of steel, its horns pointed inward, its solid, impenetrable center aimed directly at the diner's entrance. They had, in one fluid motion, blocked every car. They had blocked the exit. They had turned the Maplewood diner into a trap. One by one the engines were cut, each one dying with a guttural, angry pop. The sudden, ensuing silence was heavier, more charged, and more threatening than the roar had been. The only sound was the metallic thud-click of kickstands hitting the pavement. For a single, agonizing second, the diner held its breath. Then the door was shoved open. It wasn't jingled. It wasn't pushed. It was shoved, a violent, percussive act. The door slammed back against the interior wall with a crack that made Eliza flinch violently, a sound like a bone breaking. The first man stepped inside. He was huge, his shoulders barely clearing the doorframe. He did not look around. He simply stepped to the left and stood, his arms crossed, his face a granite mask. The second man entered. He stepped to the right. Then the third. The fourth. The fifth. They filed in, a silent, orderly, terrifying procession, one by one lining the walls on either side. They were a tide of black leather, road-worn denim, and heavy boots. The diner, which had felt spacious, suddenly became claustrophobic. The room was full of men, full of presence, full of an unnameable ancient menace. The air changed. The warm, comforting, familiar smell of butter, syrup, and coffee was instantly chemically obliterated. The new atmosphere was a sharp, acrid assault. The tang of cold exhaust, the hot reek of engine oil, and the deep, primal animal smell of damp, road-worn leather. It was the smell of the outside, of the highway, of a tribe that lived by a different, harder set of rules. In the booth behind Eliza, the sound of Marcus's voice had died in his throat, choked off as if by a physical hand. The entire diner just froze. Marcus's smirk is gone. He's realizing, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, what it feels like to be scared, to be small, to be prey. If you're as ready as I am to see him get exactly what he deserves, smash that like button. Let's show the algorithm we don't stand for cowards. The blood had drained from Marcus's face, leaving behind a pasty, greenish-white mask of terror. His eyes, which had been so full of cruel confidence, were now wide, darting, and animal-like. His fork, loaded with a bite of cheeseburger, was suspended halfway to his mouth. The bikers now lining the walls did not scan the room. They didn't have to. They all faced the front, creating a corridor and aisle of judgment. And at the end of that aisle, at the counter, the final piece of the puzzle moved. The old vinyl stool gave a low, protesting creak as Jax, the mountain of leather who had not moved, finally swiveled. He didn't just turn. It was a slow, deliberate rotation, as if a statue were coming to life. He planted his heavy boots on the linoleum and stood. He rose to his full height, a tower of a man, blocking the light from the front windows. His back, which had been a wall, now revealed the front. The leather vest was a tapestry of patches, but one dead center was all that mattered. A white patch stark against the black. President. He was not just a member. He was the leader. His steel-cold eyes, the ones that had been watching in the mirror, were no longer reflective. They were active. And they were fixed, with a terrible, patient, calculating stillness, directly on Marcus. Jax's boots made no sound on the worn linoleum. He moved with a deliberate, unsettling grace, a mass of black leather and denim gliding through the charged air. The diner was so quiet, the only sound was the high-pitched, terrified whine in Marcus's throat as he tried to suck in air. Jax did not walk to the Bullies' booth. He bypassed them completely as if they were irrelevant, just another piece of furniture. He walked the corridor of his men, a silent honor guard, and stopped directly at Eliza's table. Eliza flinched, her body tensing as his shadow fell over her, even larger and more complete than Marcus's had been. She was trapped, her back to the wall, her chair folded beside her. Then the mountain bent. With a sound of creaking leather and a dry crack from his knees, Jax knelt. It was not a gesture of subservience, but of focus. He lowered his entire massive frame to bring his face level with hers. He was now at her eye level. For the first time she saw his eyes up close. They weren't angry. They were devoid of heat, like deep, still water, and they held an almost analytical calm. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the open sketchbook, on the obscene red sticky wound that had obliterated her work. He stared at it for a long, silent 5 seconds, his expression unreadable, taking in every detail of the violation. His voice, when it came, was not a roar. It was a low, grinding gravel, a sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He did this. It wasn't a question that required a long answer. Eliza, her throat locked with a terror so profound it felt like ice, could only manage a single spastic nod. That was all he needed. Jax's gaze lifted from the book and met hers. He held her eyes for a single profound second, and in that look, a silent, binding contract was passed. Then he stood. He didn't just stand, he rose, unfolding to his full, towering height. He seemed to suck the very air from the room as he pivoted, slowly, to face the booth behind her. Marcus was a statue of terror. His face, which had been a pasty greenish-white, was now slick with a cold, greasy sweat. His mouth hung open, his half-eaten cheeseburger forgotten. The fork in his hand was visibly trembling, rattling against the plate. Jax took one step toward him. "You ruined the lady's art." It was a statement. A verdict. The final, flat pronouncement of a judge. Marcus's entire body jerked. He tried to speak, but only a wet, strangled sound came out. He tried again, his voice a squeaking, adolescent plea, utterly broken. It was just a joke, man. I didn't mean. It was just a joke. The word man hung in the air, a pathetic, desperate attempt to claim a status he had just irrevocably lost. Jax's face did not change. His expression remained one of absolute, wintry stillness. "Sit," he commanded. Marcus, who was already half-crouching in a pathetic attempt to stand and flee, was so shocked by the command that his legs simply gave out. He fell back into the vinyl booth with a whoosh of air, his eyes wide, his body now a trembling, incoherent mass. Jax was in total control. He was the conductor of this terrified, silent orchestra. He turned his head just slightly. His gaze landed on the bully who had first laughed. "You," he said, and the man flinched as if struck. "Get a towel. Get a glass of water from the waitress. You're going to clean this lady's table." The man stared, paralyzed. Behind him, one of the bikers, without a word, simply crossed his arms. The gesture was so menacing, so full of implied violence, that the bully yelped and scrambled out of the booth, running to the kitchen. Jax's gaze shifted. It landed on the other friend, the one who was trying to become invisible, to melt into the upholstery. "You," Jax rumbled. "You're paying for everyone's breakfast. The whole diner." The man gaped, his face a mask of comical horror. I don't have that." "Your friend here," Jax said, gesturing at Marcus's expensive watch, "looks like he can cover you." He then pointed to Mr. Henderson at the counter, who was watching, rapt. "You'll start by paying for his." The second bully, his face ashen, fumbled, his hands shaking for his wallet. And finally, Jax's full, undivided attention returned to Marcus. The main event. "And you," he said, his voice dropping even lower. Jax reached back, his hand grabbing the thick, heavy chain that snaked from his belt to his back pocket. He gave it a pull. With a clack of metal, he pulled out his own wallet, a thick, scarred leather brick. He flipped it open. He deliberately, slowly pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. He held it up. Then he slapped it down onto Marcus's table. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot. "That," Jax said, tapping the bill, "is what this page is worth. You are going to take this. You are going to walk over to that lady. You are going to give it to her. And you are going to apologize." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Not to me. To her." This was the false resolution. This was the easy way out. Marcus, his entire body shaking, his face a mess of tears and sweat, fumbled with the $100 bill. He slid out of the booth, his legs like jelly. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He stumbled the 2 steps to Eliza's table, his eyes fixed on the floor. He held out the money, his hand trembling so violently the bill vibrated. I'm sorry," he stammered, his gaze glued to the ruined sketchbook. "Here?" The entire diner watched, holding its breath. This was the moment. The payment. The end. Eliza looked at the trembling hand offering the money. She looked at the crisp bill. Then she looked up, past the money, and met Marcus's terrified, tear-filled, pathetic eyes. And in that instant, something inside her, something that had been cold and hollow, ignited. The fear was gone, burned away by a sudden, pure and righteous cold. Her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a victim. It was quiet, it was shaking, but it was clear as a bell, and it cut through the diner's silence. "No." Marcus froze. Jax, who had been watching with a look of grim satisfaction, raised an eyebrow. Eliza raised her hand, not the one that trembled but the steady one, her drawing hand. She did not slap his hand away. She simply, firmly pushed his hand and the money back toward him. The $100 bill fluttered from his grasp and landed, unnoticed, on the floor. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You can't buy it back. You can't pay for this." She pointed to her sketchbook. You ruined it. And you liked it. The money doesn't fix it." Eliza refused the money. She didn't want a payoff, she wanted justice. She demanded respect, not a transaction. If you stand with Eliza, if you believe that human dignity and passion are not for sale, comment, "Respect is priceless" down below. Show everyone you are not on the side of entitled brats like Marcus who think money and power can buy them out of any consequence. The diner was frozen. This was not part of the script. This was a new, terrifying, and incredible development. Marcus was left standing, his hand outstretched, his purpose lost, looking more pathetic than ever. All eyes went to Jax. What would he do? The woman had just refused his judgment. Jax stared at Eliza for a long, unreadable 10 seconds. His stony expression flickered with something. It was not anger. It was surprise. And then, beneath it, a profound, deep, and undeniable respect. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. He gave a single, deep nod. He turned back to Marcus, who was still frozen in his tableau of rejection. "The lady's right," Jax's voice boomed, no longer a gravelly whisper, but a full-throated proclamation that filled the room. He let the words hang in the air, a new sentence. "You can't pay for it." He looked at Marcus, then his gaze dropped, deliberately, to the linoleum floor by Eliza's booth, the floor where her pencil lay. "So you'll work for it." Marcus's head snapped up, his face a mask of confused horror. What? Jax jerked his head toward the kitchen, where Brenda was watching, her hands over her mouth. "The lady's art is gone. You're going to scrub the floor where she works. Get on your knees." He then made a sweeping gesture, encompassing the entire diner from the counter to the front door. "You're washing this entire diner's floor. Right now." The sheer, poetic brilliance of the punishment stunned the room into silence. This wasn't just humiliation. This was penitence. Brenda, her eyes wide, suddenly understood. A fierce, sudden joy lit her face. She darted into the back. Mr. Henderson, at the counter, let out a single, sharp bark of a laugh. A second later, a red plastic bucket clattered onto the floor from the kitchen, followed by a spray bottle and a handful of white rags. Marcus stared at the bucket as if it were a venomous snake. I'm not. I can't. He looked at Jax, pleading. Jax just stared back, his face an impassive mask. Marcus looked desperately at his two friends. The one with the wallet was busy counting out bills for Mr. Henderson. The other was scrubbing Eliza's table with a furious, terrified energy. No one was coming to save him. A biker by the door, without a word, took a single heavy-booted step forward. That was all it took. With a sound, a low, guttural animal wail of complete and total abject humiliation, Marcus collapsed. He fell to his hands and knees, his expensive jeans soaking up a small puddle of spilled water. His hands, which had so casually destroyed Eliza's art, fumbled with the rags. He was on his knees, in the center of the diner, in front of her. The climax was complete. The reckoning had begun. The only sound in the diner was the wet, rhythmic sh of the rag in Marcus's hand. It was a pathetic, scrubbing sound, the soundtrack of his complete and total undoing. He was on all fours, his expensive jeans soaked, his face a mask of sweat and salty, humiliated tears. Then a new sound. It started at the counter. Mr. Henderson, his face grim but his eyes alive, slowly, deliberately brought his hands together. Clap. It was a signal. A permission slip for the rest of the room. It was followed by another. And another. Brenda, her face streaked with her own tears, clapped, her hands smacking together. The couple in the front booth. The man by the window. Within 5 seconds, the entire diner, except for the bullies and the bikers, erupted in a wave of thunderous, cathartic applause. It wasn't just for Jax. It was for Eliza. It was the sound of the silence breaking, of the fear finally being vanquished. The two friends stood frozen, their humiliation secondary but just as complete. The one who had paid for the diner's meals was now standing with an empty wallet, his face blank with shock. The other, who had cleaned Eliza's table, was just an observer, his arms at his sides. "Don't just stand there," a biker by the door rumbled, not even looking at them. "Watch your boy work. You're his support crew." They were forced to stand, silent and powerless, and witness the full, agonizing floor-by-floor penance of their leader. The applause slowly died down as Jax turned his back on the scene. He had delivered his judgment. The execution was now just a matter of labor. He had broken Marcus not with his fists, but with a deeper, more profound understanding of justice. His face, which had been a mask of iron, softened as he looked back at Eliza. He returned to her booth, the sense of menace evaporating from him, replaced by something else. A quiet, protective gravity. He didn't kneel this time. He stood beside her, a mountain range blocking her from the rest of the room. He motioned to Brenda, who was wiping her eyes, a wide, relieved smile on her face. "Brenda," Jax's voice was still a gravelly rumble, but the ice was gone. "The ladies' breakfast was interrupted. Bring her a fresh plate of pancakes. And anything else she wants. The whole menu if she likes." He looked at Eliza, a flicker of a smile in his steel-cold eyes. "It's all on the house." His gaze dropped back to the table, to the ruined sketchbook that still lay open, a testament to the day's wound. With a gentleness that was shocking in a man so large, he used one thick, calloused finger to nudge the leather cover. He didn't look inside at the mess. He simply, respectfully closed it, covering the wound. "This is a wound," he rumbled, his voice low, "for her alone." He tapped the leather cover. "He broke this. But he didn't break you." He looked her right in the eye, and the weight of his stare was absolute. "You're an artist. You'll make more." It was a statement of fact. A validation of her identity. He wasn't just a protector. He was the first person in that diner, perhaps in her life, who had looked past the chair, past the tremor, past the victim, and seen the artist. Then he did something no one in that diner would ever forget. He reached up, his hands grabbing the collar of his own heavy leather vest, the one with the president patch, the symbol of his power, his life, his authority. With a single heavy zip, he unzipped it. He shrugged his massive shoulders, and the vest slid from his back. He held it for a moment, then, with that same surprising gentleness, he draped it over Eliza's shoulders. It enveloped her. It was a heavy, protective armor, a blanket of leather that still held his warmth and the faint, acrid smell of the road. It swallowed her small frame, the heavy material settling on her shoulders like a royal mantle. The president, Patch, stark and white, now rested proudly on her back. He leaned in close, his voice a sacred promise. Your family now. He tapped the patch on her shoulder. No one, ever, will hurt you in this place again. And that, finally, is what broke her. The cruelty hadn't made her cry. The humiliation hadn't. The rage had been cold and dry. But the kindness, this ferocious, impossible, protective kindness, that she couldn't fight. Tears streamed down Eliza's face. They weren't the hot, stinging tears of humiliation, but the scalding, cleansing tears of profound gratitude. She was no longer alone. She was wrapped in armor, she was seen, and she was, for the first time in her life, safe. Jax gave her a single, slow nod, then turned and walked out. His men, a silent, leather-clad tide, followed him. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The diner's bell jingled softly on their exit, a return to normalcy, but the room they left behind was forever changed. They left the vest. The diner was quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet. The air was clean. The only sound was the rhythmic, humiliating scrape-splash-scrape of the rag in Marcus's hand as he scrubbed the floor, his friends forced to stand and watch in silent, abject shame. Eliza sat wrapped in the heavy armor of the vest. Brenda placed a new, steaming mug of coffee in front of her, and a fresh plate of pancakes. Eliza took a sip. The coffee was hot and strong. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the leather-bound sketchbook. She didn't open it to the wound. She flipped past the sticky, ruined pages, past the scar, to a fresh, clean, white one. She picked up her pencil. She held it over the page. Her hand, the one that had betrayed her with its tremor, was perfectly, beautifully, powerfully steady. She took a breath, the smell of graphite and coffee filling her lungs. And she began to draw. Eliza's hand was steady. She found her strength, and the bully was left cleaning up his own mess. If this story reminds you that kindness can be ferocious and that bullies always lose in the end, do one last thing. Hit subscribe. Don't be a bystander. Join the family.